This is Apple's brand new M3 Max MacBook Pro. This is a 16-inch model in space black. And it's kind of, I'll read the specs off in a second. It's like the highest pre-configured option that you can get. I believe it starts at $39.99. I'll run through the specs again right before we get into the benchmarks. But yeah, I wanted to do some tests and benchmarks to kind of see where this new machine fits and compares against the M1 Max MacBook Pro. Now, this was my machine that I used on a daily basis for so long when it came out. It was a workhorse right up until the Mac Studio, and then I tried that for a little bit, went back to that desktop life. But I absolutely love this MacBook. I used it all the time. It was so key when traveling, just having that performance and power. And so I wanted to get a quick little comparison going and run through all of the tests and things that you guys might be interested in, just like we did with the M3 Pro. And if you missed that video, you can click the card here in the upper right corner. Now, before we jump into the benchmarks and everything, I just wanted to show you, here is a comparison between the space black and the space gray colors. And yeah, I mean, on camera, I think it doesn't really reflect just how different it is. It might kind of seem the same. So here's space gray, and then when I move it away, here's space black. Again, kind of hard to get that true color differentiation on camera. But in my opinion, it is substantially darker. But again, oftentimes when you look at it in specific lighting scenarios, it doesn't really look that much different. So it's really hard to explain. But like when I'm looking at it right now, I can clearly tell the difference. But in some cases, it just doesn't always look like that. So yeah, just consider it a couple shades darker than what you had with the space gray MacBook Pros. I really like the color. I really like that the fingerprints are kind of hard to see on this. Now, when you open it up in terms of fingerprints, I am noticing a little bit more, but it's not nearly as bad. I mean, some of the oils from my hands and resting on the trackpad and everything, it seems to be okay, but it's a little bit more noticeable than what you get on the top and the bottom of the new MacBook Pro. Now, one last thing before we start talking about the results of the benchmarks and tests that I ran, here are the configurations for each MacBook Pro. So again, these are both 16-inch models. Here on my right is the 16-inch M3 Max. It comes with 48 gigabytes of memory here in this configuration. And we have 16 CPU cores, and I believe it's 40 GPU cores. Yes, 40 GPU cores. We do have 1 terabyte SSD and 48 gigs of RAM. On the M1 Max, it's 32 gigs of RAM, and I believe the cores are a little bit lower. It's not substantial, but it's going to make a difference in this test, and I understand that. Yeah, so we have 10 cores here for the CPU, and then on the GPU, I believe it is 32. Let's jump right into our first test, and that was Cinebench. I did the CPU only, so we did multi-core and single-core tests. And there's some interesting things here. I mean, it's not that interesting in terms of like who scored better. Obviously, the M3 Max scored 1601 to be precise in terms of multi-core compared to 788 on the M1 Max. And then we had 111 points for the single core compared to 140 points for the single core on the M3 Max. So not that big of a differential in single core. I mean, it's still like 29 points, but compared to 788 and 1601, it's almost double for multi-core. So what we're gathering here is that the multi-core is much, much stronger here on the M3 Max compared to the M1 Max. So one of the interesting things here that I see is that when you look at the CPU multi-core ranking that Cinebench provides from some of the other machines that are close to its class, it actually almost outperforms the M1 Ultra. That had a 1625, and again, the M3 Max had 1601. And when you look at the M1 Max, it was kind of like 7th on the list, right behind another M1 Max score. So we were a little bit off of what Cinebench usually gets. They got 791 for multi. We got 788. So it's not that big of a difference for single core, kind of what we gathered here with the tests anyways, but multi-core is the real story, and there is a huge difference with M3 Max. All right, let's jump into Blender tests for rendering out images in a 3D model here. And, you know, it's obviously going to lean towards the M3 Max. We got a render time. This is the classroom render. It's a pretty popular render test that a lot of people do. It's got a lot of textures and things that it needs to render out. And so, you know, it finished in 3 minutes and 28 seconds on the M3 Max. And when you look at the M1 Max, quite a bit of time here passed of 8 minutes and 25 seconds. So that's nearly 5 minutes, a little over 5 minutes of time that you're saving with the M3 Max. So I know that there's an argument to be made with a lot of these tests where it's like, well, 5 minutes, you know, it's not that big of a deal, but that stuff adds up. 5 minutes every day of your workday. So 5 minutes for 5 days times 52 weeks, or however you want to do the math, it will add up to saving work days of your life. And so when it comes to GPU performance, we're going to look at things like exporting Final Cut timelines, which is, you know, important to me because that's what I do on a daily basis. But like you can kind of see how the graphics cores work and how the benchmarks kind of stand there. But when it comes to like gaming or, you know, we're looking at GFX Metal benchmarks here specifically. And that's kind of measuring out in frames per second, which you're going to want, you know, up to around 120. And it looks like both machines kind of do that for both high level and low level tests. Really the biggest difference when it comes to the M1 Max and the M3 Max is when you're looking at texturing. We got 55 frames per second on the M1 Max and 63 frames per second on the M3. And then for the Final Cut export, it was a 16-minute 4K timeline. I had a lot of effects, a lot of custom LUTs with two different types of cameras. So there was iPhone footage shot in Apple ProRes log. This was the 15 Pro Max mini review that I did. So yeah, we had Apple ProRes log footage there with a custom LUT that I put on it, and then my own Sony FX3 and Sony A7S III. So 3 different cameras, different footage, different custom LUTs put on each camera. And so that usually bogs things down. We did a multi-pass export. That's kind of the longest, more intense one. And we had 7 minutes and 33 seconds on the M1 Max. And we saved about 2 minutes on the M3 Max with a total of 5 minutes and 29 seconds. So a little over a 2-minute difference there. And again, it's not as big of a difference, not a 5-minute difference like the Blender test, but 2 minutes adds up. I'm doing it multiple times per day. And so when it comes to actual performance while editing and like using those plugins and moving about the timeline, both machines work really, really well. I never really noticed a lot of drop frames. I will say there have been a couple of drop frames on the M1 Max, more so than the M3, but it's still early. I feel like the more I put on this machine and start to use it day in and day out, it starts to become more of that like, okay, yeah, we don't quite have that same level of performance. But again, overall, both machines never impact my actual editing timeline. And that's kind of the gist of everything. I mean, these tests show, these benchmarks really do show you that the M3 Max has a pretty substantial gain compared to the M1 Max, but when it comes to real world, aside from saving time, but like actual performance while performing those tasks, it's nothing super noticeable in my opinion. When it comes to SSD speeds, I did want to give you a quick update on that. M3 Max write, I hit over 6,000 multiple times. I hit like 6,197 was the one that I pulled from here. Read speeds were kind of always at 5,030-ish, right around there. Never really went over that mark on the M3 Max. Now with the M1 Max, the weird thing is my read speeds were always at like 5,200 or more. So we had better read speeds on the M1 Max compared to the M3, but the M1 write speeds were a little under 6,000. So, I mean, I don't really think that that's going to translate into anything meaningful there either. Kind of looks like they're right in line with each other. They should be. I don't think the SSDs are that drastically different, and they're both 1 terabyte SSDs from Apple. So yeah, that's really it when it comes to benchmarks, honestly. I think these machines are fantastic. Do I think you should upgrade from the M1 Max? Just depends on what you're working on as usual, but you saw the performance gains, the real world exports there. If you're a Final Cut user like myself, if you're using Blender, you will see that there is a noticeable difference between each chip. It's whether or not you think it's worth dropping some extra money. But I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. Let me know, what do you think about the color first off? What do you think about the performance and the whole export test that we did in the benchmarks? Let me know down in those comments. This has been Dan with Mac Rumors. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you around in the next video.